Perfect. So I have just introduced you actually in your absence, and now, so right. I hope I did a good job. Everybody knows you. The only thing I didn't say is that Professor Arnold has worked for the past 30 years on identitarian discourse, the rewriting of the Western literary canon in the Caribbean, and the role of the literary hoax in reasserting dominance in multi-ethnic societies. And now I will just say a few words on on our moderator tonight, on the person who will discuss with you, Dr. Tal Sela, who is a postdoc fellow in the French department at Bar-Ilan University. Tal received his PhD from the University of Strasbourg in 2017. He wrote his dissertation on the early literary works of Ousmane Sembène and Mongo Betty. His article on Jean-Paul Sartre and the anti-apartheid movement in France was published recently. He is currently conducting research under my supervision on pilgrimage from West Africa to the Holy Land. Tal is also a member of the Groupe Adar, and he is teaching a course at the University of Tel Aviv on the history of relations between France and Africa. And without further ado, we apologize for the time it took us to begin, but let's go. Tal, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Galia, for giving me the opportunity to work closely, even for a little while, with such an eminent researcher in the field of littérature antillaise. And I thank you, James, for your trust, as well as for your interest, for the interesting discussions that we had the last couple of weeks. And I admit that the subject, I will share a screen. The subject that I was very intrigued by the title of your paper. In the few courses that I took in France on the so-called littérature antillaise, the notion of national identity had never come up in relation to the Antilles, although intellectuals of the French West Indies were always busy in defining models of identity and cultural relations between communities and collective identities. One only has to think about concepts such as le tout monde, créolité, créolisation, antianité, and so forth. In this perspective, your book, James, may give the possibility to rethink the concept of national identity in the context of the Antilles, as for the role of the writer in shaping this identity. In my opinion, these questions are important not only in giving us a better understanding on the history of the specific geopolitical regions of the Antilles, but they may also be useful in our times where constructions, deconstructions, and reconstructions of national identity have become an urgent issue in France. And I think, for example, on the recent interview of Macron in L'Express, and obviously in Israel, where national identity is constantly challenged by many other collective identities. I believe that the paper that we are about to hear and the discussion that will be followed may inspire us with new ideas concerning the profound crisis that the nation state is confronting at the moment, more or less everywhere around the world. And James, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tal. I'm really very touched at the encouraging statement that you just made about this recent book. As you know, it's been reviewed a few times in the French West Indies, and it's hard to say what its future is, but your early reception is very comforting, and I hope it may be a harbinger of things to come. I want, first of all, to thank the Department of French Culture at Bar-Ilan University for asking me to participate in your seminar on la richesse de la culture et de la littérature francophone. When I received your invitation 2 months ago, our notion of audience did not extend beyond the Faculty of Humanities at Bar-Ilan. Since then, requests to participate in this webinar have come in from professors on 3 continents. I believe we will have colleagues participating from the Institut des Textes et Manuscrits Modernes of the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, from Barnard College in the city of New York, and from the University of Virginia, as well as our host institution. And there may well be others of whom I am not aware. Professor Galia Januszewski, whom I thank for her words of welcome, decided in the interests of clarifying the social science concepts that underlie my argument to conduct the webinar in English, since we hoped for participation from sociologists and anthropologists whose French might not be up to the mark. That decision was taken before we learned that colleagues working on the Schwarz-Bart archive in Paris would like to participate. To them, and to any other colleagues who prefer to work at French, I apologize at the outset. In order to facilitate participation by both groups, the ground rules for today's discussion assume code switching wherever necessary. Everyone should feel free to ask questions or to clarify the subject under discussion in whichever language they prefer. Dr. Tal-Sela and I will work bilingually to smooth out the wrinkles in communication. My questions and comments today refer to the seminar paper we tabled a week ago. The book on which it is based sums up a half-century of reflection on Caribbean literature in the broadest sense, and on the exceptional situation of les Antilles Françaises in particular. The original invitation extended by Professor Januszewski suggested that I speak on négritude, a subject on which I wrote a book 40 years ago. It is still frequently cited. Since the 1980s, I have come to realize that négritude was never political beyond the will to end colonial empires from the mid-1950s onward. Editions in French and English of Aimé Césaire's earliest work in the 1930s and 1940s have, in the past decade, demonstrated that Césaire's aim in his long poem and in short essays he published in Martinique, Haiti, and New York during the Second World War, his aim was spiritual, not political. I therefore replied to Professor Januszewski that in order to make sense of the subject, I had to broaden it considerably. What we are undertaking today is a preliminary examination of a number of questions raised by research I conducted in the course of a long career. My goal is to stimulate reflection on basic questions underlying the production, publication, and reception of literature that claims to represent French West Indian society. This webinar is, I suspect, a harbinger of things to come. I speak to you from North America while you participate from anywhere on the globe. Although our communication may be somewhat complicated, the opportunity for rapid international transmission of current scholarship is much improved by current technology. Using the seminar paper as a reference, along with the graphic illustrations I prepared to accompany it.
Please mute, everyone, mute, please.
Using the seminar paper as a reference text, along with the graphic illustrations I prepared to accompany it, we shall break the subject down into a few constituent parts. The topics Dr. Sela and I worked out in a preliminary way are as follows. 1. Where in the world is la littérature antillaise? 2. Representation of Creole society, real and imaginary. 3. How has the devoir de mémoire inflected the collective imaginary? And 4. Has the art of the novel changed to better represent local society? What are the implications for l'imaginaire antillais? To begin, where in the world is la littérature antillaise? You see before you a map. It is deceptive. The formulation of my question is not a bad joke, nor is it merely rhetorical. Every citizen of Guadeloupe, Guyane Française, and Martinique is also a citizen of the European Union. Laws and regulations that organize citizens' lives in these former colonies, which France now calls les Outre-mer, are dissimilar to those of independent neighbors such as St. Lucia and Dominica. Until 1995, which is the chronological endpoint for discussion of littérature antillaise in my recent book, there was no publishing house of real significance in any of these régions monodépartementales, which is to say that authors and local readers are all dependent on norms that are established in Paris. This is what I call l'institution littéraire, following Bourdieu and Dubois. in their analysis of the sociological function of the publishing industry. I consider it folly to attempt to discuss the meaning of contemporary littérature francophone outside of this circuit of production, editorial manipulation, and commercial positioning in the marketplace. At various junctures in La littérature antillaise entre histoire et mémoire, I returned to the necessity of recognizing norms, codes, or conventions that local authors are obliged to recognize, whether to submit to them or to challenge and attempt to modify those norms in the interests of their art. To give a preliminary answer to my own question and to stimulate further discussion, I submit that littérature antillaise is not, and never has been, physically located in Guadeloupe, Guyane, and Martinique, unless it was produced locally for local readers. That local production, which rarely extended beyond the realm of folklore and traditions in Creole society, is not and never has been littérature francophone, the term reserved in France for the literature supposed to originate in, quote, the islands for our delectation in the, quote, métropole. The next section of my presentation will demonstrate the complexity of the problem. Representation of Creole society, real and imaginary. Those of you who signed up in advance for the webinar should have received copies of the 4 graphic illustrations I sent to Bar-Ilan at the University of Virginia. Each one is a pyramidal model that assumes a hierarchy of value based on local habits and institutions. Once interiorized, the model, which is a function of collective memory, is then subjected to the norms of l'institution littéraire by local authors for their readership outside the Caribbean. Figure 1, which is now on your screen, represents the plural society model worked out by the Jamaican sociologist M.G. Smith in 1960. As reproduced in the literary and historical work of E.K. Brathwaite, who was born in Barbados and worked as a historian in Jamaica, it excluded the, quote, latecomers who entered Creole society after 1848. The question before us is whether hard lines existed in the Antilles Françaises between the ethno classes that constituted Creole society in 1848. They are essentially 3. You see them on your screen. For the benefit of those participants who know little about Caribbean colonial history, let's schematize rapidly. From 1685 onward, Jews and Protestants were excluded from the colonies of the Compagnie des Indes Occidentales and the state monopolies that succeeded it. Although prohibited by the Code Noir, procreation by European masters with African slave women was common and resulted in the early establishment of an intermediary caste of free people of color who were sometimes recognized by their fathers and educated in France. A century later, this ethno class, known as mulâtres or mulattoes, owned plantations and slaves, raised militias, and participated in the political life of the colony of Saint-Domingue. These are uncontested historical realities. The question as regards the possibility of a national project in the Antilles Françaises is whether relations between and among these ethno classes have evolved over time. Let us look briefly at figure 2, which you now see on your screen. The extent to which a raciological hierarchy is maintained within French West Indian society is illustrated in this figure, which was prepared by the Franco-Guadeloupean sociologist Michel Giraud. It is important to recognize that these categories are not imposed from the outside, that is to say, by the former colonial power, but from within island societies by those who either have status or who struggle to attain it. There is therefore an implied superiority of the ethno classes represented in figure 1 over those represented in figure 2. The groups called étrangers by Michel Giraud were considered latecomers to Creole society in Jamaica by E.K. Brathwaite. Creole society had been established prior to their arrival in the post-emancipation Caribbean, and these preconceptions, I'll call them, have been maintained down to the present time. Figure 3 will help you grasp why I did not feel discussing negritude in isolation made sense. In the prologue to my book published last year by Classique Garnier, I offered several analyses of the career of Toussaint Louverture in Saint-Domingue. Each one makes sense only within the limitations of a specific ethno-class version of the role played by Toussaint. In the case of Aimé Césaire, several strange phenomena stand out. One, he never mentioned Raphaël Tardon, who was active as a civil servant and mulatto apologist at the time Césaire entered politics. Two, in his stage play La Tragédie du Roi Christophe, Césaire distorted the reality of Henri Christophe's realm in the north of Haiti in order to affirm a negritude unsullied by mulatto influences. And three, in Memorial for Louis Delgrès, a well-known poem on the disaster at Fort Matouba, Guadeloupe in May 1802, Césaire disguised this mulatto officer so as to make him appear a hero of negritude. It is clear that Césaire was working as a race man, as Afro-Americans say, or used to say, in the United States. He was willing to affirm the devoir de mémoire to the point of obscuring or effacing the embarrassing presence of mulattoes in his narrative. Figure 4, now on your screen, still includes the foreigners. This diagram was devised by Michel Giraud around 1980. It comes closest to representing the competing claims of ethno-classes within Creole society in the Antilles Françaises. You will note the built-in scale of values linked to skin color. Within the French West Indies, these values are generally understood. They have been interiorized and do not need to be rendered explicit. They have analogs in each of the cultural traditions that came out of plantation society across the Caribbean region and indeed in the plantation south of my own country and in Brazil. You may wish to return to the implications of this raciological hierarchy, which is a function of memory, in the discussion period. 3, how has the devoir de mémoire inflected the collective imaginary? This question is disingenuous, as you know if you've read the seminar paper in advance. The recent tendency to prefer the devoir de mémoire over historical research has had a marked effect on the collective imaginary. Writers of fiction have been largely responsible for inflecting the representation of French West Indian history toward versions that are marketable in Paris, which is to say that the asymmetrical power relations of norms and codes has been hard at work. If you have read the seminar paper, you are already aware of the contentious history of representations of Toussaint Louverture in both imaginative literature and in essays since the end of the Second World War. To focus our discussion today, I propose that we attend to one extraordinary example: the creation by the author of Le Dernier des Justes, André Schwarz-Bart, of a violent scene he proposed as the origin of the mulatto ethnoclass. In La Mulâtresse Solitude, he systematized the rape of African women on board slave ships, thus turning a historical fact into a synecdoche that now serves as an originary myth. My research into this term and the reality it is supposed to express involved questioning several historians who have specialized in life aboard slave ships, and also an American novelist who used this synecdoche to grisly effect. The novelist told me in an email that he could not recall where he found the term. None of the historians I consulted, nor the medical doctor Franz Tardodino, could find any evidence of historical systematization of this brutal act, which appears to have been exceptional and certainly not a norm. André Schwarz-Bart employed a term from bird hunting, la pariade, which he capitalized to give the impression of a regularly scheduled procedure, of which I have traced the origins in an earlier novel by Raphaël Tardon, who describes under another name the process of systematic fertilization of female slaves in order to increase their market value on arrival in the plantation colonies of the Western Hemisphere. The literary motif on which both Tardon and Schwarz-Bart based their fiction is well known in American literary history as the tragic mulatto. Indeed, in the final chapter of La Mulâtresse Solitude, the author renders this goal explicit. I cite in English. The old class of mulattoes was entirely destroyed, end quote, in the explosion of Fort Matouba, which its defenders sacrificed rather than submit to re-enslavement. In his epilogue, Schwarz-Bart ties the elimination of the mulatto ethnoclass as an established elite to the Shoah, He tells his reader that he wished to memorialize not only the mulatto elite of Guadeloupe, but also, I quote, the phantoms who wander through the humiliated ruins of Warsaw. Some of you may be familiar with François Nudelman's 2014 article that criticizes conflating the Shoah and the slave trade. What should we make of this? In the context of conflicted national identity in the Antilles Françaises, La Mulâtresse Solitude stands in stark opposition to the Négritude version championed by Aimé Césaire. Each is partial in both senses of the word, and each intends to cancel out the claims of the other. Taken together, both render the creation of an inclusive national identity all the more problematic. They do not open onto a national project, but present a tragic vision that we might characterize as neither nor. They suggest a blocked evolution of national consciousness in the mid-20th century. Now to my last point. Has the art of the novel changed to better represent local society? What are the implications for l'imaginaire antillais? I hope some participants in the webinar will have read the concluding section of the paper I tabled as preparation for today's encounter. In it, I presented a necessarily schematic version of the argument in the two final chapters of La littérature antillaise, entre histoire et mémoire. The Martinican Creolists replicated, in the name of an already creolized society, the ethno-class divisions you have seen depicted in the graphic illustrations we looked at earlier. Their depiction of relations between men and women reproduce, without challenging them, the violence exercised by men against women. On the one hand, it is true that this violence can be found in the origins of Creole society throughout the Caribbean. To represent it as normal, however, within the fictional codes of realism, is to inflect the imaginary in such a way as to titillate a readership which we know to be located outside the Caribbean. In short, an authorial decision was made for Creolist fiction to satisfy the literary marketplace. In that sense, and to that degree, l'institution littéraire has conditioned how French West Indian society is to be represented. In my final chapter, I looked closely at recent fiction by Guadeloupean women writers, with a focus on Maryse Condé, whom you may have read, and Dany Bébel-Gisler, whom you almost certainly haven't. Both authors hold up to criticism the victimization of women by men in and outside marriage, and they demonstrate that the presumably hard lines between ethno-classes are an illusion. In her multi-generational novels, Maryse Condé has given a forceful counterexample to the masculinist vision, disseminated with considerable success by Martinican Creolists. My final comments prior to general discussion will pivot away from the sociological perspective I have adopted to this point in order to discuss specifically literary concerns. On rereading the French West Indian corpus for my book-length analysis, I realized that the collaboration between Edouard Glissant and Patrick Chamoiseau from the early 1990s onward had also produced fruitful innovations that break down the tragic vision I adumbrated in Aimé Césaire's and André Schwarz-Bart's treatment of the disaster that crushed the French Revolution in Guadeloupe in 1802. I shall ask those of you who have had access to 10 or so pages of my book made available to early registrants to refer to them at this point. My final move in this presentation will be to show how Edouard Glissant, over a period of 40 years, worked his way out of the tragic mode in which he cast his first novel, La Lézarde, in 1958. The Renaudot Prize Glissant received for La Lézarde is considered second only to the Goncourt in recognizing an important new talent. His later career and the success of the tout monde concept have eclipsed the perspective of his first published work. As a young poet and novelist, Glissant shared with Césaire a reliance on symbolic geography. The Mornes, or hills, were presumed to be the refuge of a free and independent Creole culture that had escaped the prison of the plantation. The plain, on the other hand, kept the slaves and their freed descendants in a colonial bondage they were unable to challenge and break. The title of the novel La Lézarde both refers to a real river in Martinique and symbolically represents the gash of history, the connotation of the word lézarde. The plot unfolds during the post-war elections that would end formal colonial status and institute the regime of overseas départements. The hero, Taël, is a descendant of those who escaped into the Marne directly from the slave ship, who have never served a colonial master. The young woman he intends to take as his bride is a daughter of the plain. She ascends the symbolic hill or Marne with Taël, but on arrival is torn to pieces by his dogs. The plot does not prepare the reader for this conclusion, which is comprehensible only as a symbolic working out of a tragic destiny. The daughter of the plain must die because she cannot know the freedom of the Maroons. This conclusion is poetic and tragic, but does not result from the narrative action. In that respect, Glissant was still attached to the tragic vision of history that informed Césaire's play And the Dogs Were Silent from 1946 to 1956. The heroic Maroon as tutelary figure was important in Césaire's negritude ideology, and it would continue to be used by the Martinican Creolists. The Maroon was never a real, that is, historical figure of his cultural continuity in the Antilles Françaises. Guadeloupe and Martinique were simply too small for a remote hinterland to sustain a Maroon community of the sort that thrived in Jamaica and Suriname. In short, the literary Maroon in French West Indian literature always sprang from the devoir de mémoire, never from the island's actual history. In the mid-1960s, Glissant returned to Martinique to teach. Once again in contact with his native culture after a long period in Paris, he organized the Institut Martiniquais d'études. In 1981, he published the insights he gained from sustained study of Creolophone culture in Le Discours Antillais. That volume of collected essays linked the history of the Creole language to labor, whether on the plantation, on fishing boats, or in other trades. Glissant foresaw that as these trades succumbed to the pressures of French consumer culture, the Creole language would shrivel and eventually die out. His crucial insight concerning the novel as an artistic form was his condemnation of the realist aesthetic, which he tied to the trajectory of colonialism and the logic of domination. The novels he published in the next decade are principally concerned with disrupting the normative codes of realism. He found original ways to short-circuit the logic of dominance implicit in historical narration. Most importantly, at the level of form, he attacked the reliable narrator directly, replacing him with the consciousness of a woman who appears mad in the perspective of French institutions. Time does not allow for a fuller treatment of Glissant's contribution to national consciousness through his essays and novels, as well as his late poetry and the play Monsieur Toussaint. It is important to keep in mind, moreover, that all the sources I have cited originate in, are cycled through, and touch only an elite culture. The spillover from belles-lettres to political thought and public policy is slight and always mediated by a political party's narrow aims and goals. I hope I have clarified sufficiently in the course of my oral remarks the extent to which forging an inclusive national consciousness in the Antilles Françaises has been and remains painfully difficult. Events in the United States over the past year, and spectacularly in the past week, demonstrate all too clearly that the underlying issues we are discussing here have important consequences in the life of every multicultural democracy. We ignore them at our peril. Thank you. I'll turn the webinar over to Dr. Tal Sela in Tel Aviv, who will serve as our interlocutor for the discussion section.
Thank you very much, James. We may applaud for this clear and enlightening presentations on the presentation on the extremely complex history of the French Antilles. And I think what strikes me the most are the different forces that are involved in the politics of identity within the Antilles society. You have mentioned power relations based on racial grounds and on an economical classes that derive from racial identities. Then there are social groups coming from elsewhere with their own cultural particularity, blending in the local society. There is also religion affiliations, gender inequalities where women are oppressed by men, and also the African reminiscence, and on top of that, the French connection. On another level, we find the writers, poets, or novelists who do not succeed in the task of imagining ways to hold together this social mosaic. Instead, as you mentioned, they stress the tensions between social identities by focusing on a certain narrative on the expense of the others. And if I may, I will ask you we'll open the question session. And in my question, I would like to go back to the 1950s, to the process of decolonization. When African intellectuals gave up the dream of assimilation and turned towards independence and the creation of a nation state, the writers were called to construct a national identity in their text. Fanon, for example, wrote about littérature de combat, littérature révolutionnaire, littérature nationale in Les Damnés de la Terre. And Jacques Stéphane Alexis wrote an article in Présence africaine in 1957, débat autour des conditions d'un roman national chez les peuples noirs. Où va le roman? We know how he ended. And I would like to remind that Fanon as well as Alexis are both an antillaise intellectuals. In the case of Césaire and La Martinique, it is quite confusing because Césaire was obviously anti-colonialist. He was not at all nationalist. He took a stand for departementalism. He wanted to stay attached to France and struggled against the countercurrent of dépendantisme. In this political stance of Césaire, what I wanted to ask is this political stance of Césaire possibly related to the fact that he sticked religiously to his identité nègre. He kind of cultivated his image of nègre fondamental, nègre, je suis nègre, je resterai, and so on. And my second question is that obviously when Césaire gave up independence, it was no longer possible to create a sustainable national project and identity. And if so, in your opinion, James, what are the alternatives of creating an inclusive collective identity other than the national one? I turn to you.
Thank you, Tal. I'll try to answer your questions more or less in order. To begin with, from the mid-1930s, when he was a student in Paris and articulated in a student newspaper the notion of négritude, I've tried to point out in the book published in Würzburg in May of last year that his goals were spiritual. The version of the Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal that he published in 1939, that was modified after his encounter with the Surrealists in 2 editions published in 1947, that cahier was still essentially spiritualist in its intent. The conclusion of the poem was not political at that point, and it was meant to show the transformation of the consciousness of something like what Alan Locke called in the United States the new Negro. These are concepts out of the Harlem Renaissance with which Césaire was perfectly conscious. We now fast forward to 1956. And the first edition of that long poem that I presume everyone has read, and most readers of the poem have never read the earlier ones. That one was political. The modifications that were made at that point were made by Césaire willingly in order to turn the poem away from the Western Hemisphere, away from the Caribbean, and toward Africa. The editions that we published in 2014 in Paris in the CNRS edition volume of his literary work make that abundantly clear. At that stage, in the mid-1950s, there was, as you point out in your question, a notion of a Black world. And that lasted into the 1960s. It began to come apart after the independence movements were successful in Africa south of the Sahara, and we saw emerge regimes that were not democratic in the sense that Césaire would have liked. His initial enthusiasm for Sékou Touré in Guinea is a case in point. At the time of the proclamation of independence in Guinea, Césaire felt that what Sékou Touré was going to do was entirely right. He was disabused subsequently of that notion. I'd like now to mention briefly a fleeting moment in Césaire's political history around 1960. He published an article in Présence Africaine when Daniel Guérin published Les Antilles décolonisées. In it, Césaire argued in favor of a confederation of Caribbean states, which would have included Les Antilles Françaises. Interestingly enough, in the mid-1970s, in a first attempt to collect his literary and political works in 3 volumes by Desormeaux, in that collection, the article was not included. And it has rarely been referred to since. And most commentators on Césaire's politics don't know that that stage ever actually existed. What does this mean? I think when I say that the goals of negritude were never political beyond the attempt to decolonize Africa, it's paradoxical, I know. And this notion will not go down easily or readily. But I think in the long run, if we read Césaire, if we reread him carefully, we'll see that is the position that comes out of his work, both early and late. There's a period after the mid-1960s when Césaire, especially in his poetry, becomes more elegiac. And we see him turning back toward the negritude position of his early work and looking nostalgically at it. By the time he writes his last major collection of poetry, Moi Laminaire, published in the early 1980s, he is clearly expressing regret over having lost his way in a genealogical morass, as he puts it in one poem. And I think I'll leave my answer there and see where you'd like to go next.
Thank you, James. The floor is open for questions.
Please. Okay. Well, while we wait for other questions,
yes.
And I have a question. Actually, we have with us some students of a seminar called The Tension Between Ethics and Aesthetics. And the part that most intrigued me in that respect in your paper, James, is where you actually analyze the literary strategies employed or deployed in some novels. And you basically show that writers who want to part away from the hexagon break the novel from within, break the classical literary or novelistic strategies involved in writing. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
That was actually the last point in my opening remarks in this webinar.
Exactly.
And I cited Edouard Glissant, who, although he is hard to read and doesn't have a large popular following, is clearly the most brilliant critical thinker on this subject. From the early 1980s in Caribbean discourse, the discours antillais, from that point onward, he undertook to take apart the European novelistic tradition based on the codes of realism, which he argued were part and parcel of the colonial enterprise. Now, I don't know to what extent we're going to be successful in convincing anybody of this, but I'm sure that Glissant was right, at least in theory. And his later career as a novelist illustrates brilliantly, as you suggest, that he was undertaking in his fiction, as well as in his essays, to show how formerly colonized writers ought to try to establish themselves culturally in order to establish a form of independence from dominance by former colonial powers.
I'm trying to look for the examples. The analysis that you show is amazing, is very, very beautiful. So I'll try to look for it while we wait other questions.
C'est peut-être le moment de dire qu'on peut poser des questions en français
En
aussi.
français, bien sûr.
Oui, absolument, absolument, oui, je vous attends.
There was a question by Bill Miles. Can you identify yourself, please?
Oui. Je suis William Miles, Bill Miles. Je vous parle de Massachusetts aux États-Unis. James, c'est un plaisir de te revoir. La première fois que j'étais avec James, c'était à Dakar, n'est-ce pas, pour un colloque sur Senghor.
Oui, en décembre 2012, je crois.
Oui, exactement. Et donc, je connais très bien ce que vous faites. Ah oui, pour me présenter, je ne suis pas littéraire. Donc, je vous remercie beaucoup pour m'avoir invité. Parmi vous, je suis politologue. Et je travaille sur les Antilles françaises et surtout le Martinique, sur le plan politique. Et c'est pour cela que je dois départir un peu de mon collègue James en parlant de la non-politisation de la négritude dans l'idée de Césaire. En fait, il y avait deux Aimé Césaire. Le premier Aimé Césaire dont on parle aujourd'hui, c'est le littéraire, le roman. Le romancier, écrivain de théâtre, mais il y avait aussi un homme très politisé qui appuyait sur la négritude dans sa vie politique. À 1946, il a été élu représentant du département de Martinique. Il était député à l'Assemblée nationale en France, en représentant la Martinique. Il a servi de maire de capitale de Martinique, Fort-de-France, depuis des décennies. Mais plus important, il avait dit que la Martinique devait être autonome. Et il prenait l'autonomie politique pour la Martinique jusqu'en 1981, quand François Mitterrand s'est fait élire, et Césaire a déclaré un moratoire sur l'autonomie pour la Martinique, chose qu'il n'a jamais reniée. Et donc, pour la petite histoire, je suis marié à la Martinique, dans le sens où mon épouse est de la Martinique et j'ai des attaches très affectives, aussi bien que professionnelles. Et donc, pour la Martinique de 2021, je dirais que ce que James a présenté pour la littérature est bel et bien une partie de discours politique à travers le parti politique que Césaire a fondé, le PPM, le Parti progressiste martiniquais. Et donc, pour séparer la négritude de la politique, bon, c'est un point de désaccord qui est toujours le fruit de discours très fructifs dans des dans un milieu, un contexte académique comme celui-ci. Merci.
Si
votre réaction.
Oui, si je puis répondre directement à Bill Miles, je suis parfaitement d'accord avec lui. Je ne dirais pas qu'il y avait deux Césaire, mais il y avait certainement deux faces de Césaire. Et je souscris entièrement à tout ce que mon collègue vient de nous dire du Massachusetts. Sur le plan politique, il a absolument raison. J'ajouterai seulement ceci, que l'autre face de Césaire, le littéraire, ou je préfère dire le politique, était la face que Césaire a toujours préférée. Il a dit et redit que pour lui, le politique était toujours secondaire. Mais si vous étiez en Martinique, si vous étiez appelé aux urnes pour voter, vous pouviez, et sans doute vous deviez, ignorer cela, car Césaire, le littéraire, n'était ou était très peu lu par les électeurs martiniquais. Et là, je crois que Bill Miles sera d'accord.
Thank you very much. Yes, Francine, s'il vous plaît. Bonjour, Francine.
Est-ce que mon micro marche?
Oui.
Bonjour, je suis là, cher James Arnold, en tant que spécialiste d'André Schwarz-Bart, et je fais partie du groupe de l'ITEM à Paris, bien que j'habite Jérusalem. Et je voudrais m'écarter de Césaire et revenir à Schwarz-Bart pour avoir votre éclairage sur des développements récents concernant la mulâtresse solitude. Vous savez peut-être qu'un jardin solitude a été inauguré à Paris, à côté de statues de Dumas et de chaînes de l'esclavage, enfin, dans le cadre de la souffrance ou de l'identité antillaise. Et le nom d'André Schwarz-Bart n'y figure pas. Le mot mulâtresse a été supprimé. Vous avez expliqué qu'on tend aujourd'hui à supprimer cette identité ou à gommer l'identité mulâtresse. Et j'ai entendu beaucoup de gens dire que délibérément, on ne voulait pas appeler le jardin mulâtresse solitude, mais bien solitude. Et j'ai essayé de discuter avec des gens pour demander pourquoi on ne faisait pas référence à André Schwarz-Bart, sinon comme un des écrivains ayant abordé le thème de la mulâtresse solitude, qui est devenue une héroïne nationale et une représentation, un symbole identitaire aux Antilles. Or, presque personne ne sait, j'ai donné une conférence il y a quelques années aux Antilles et je me suis rendu compte que même les historiens n'étaient pas vraiment au fait de la genèse du roman d'André Schwarz-Bart. Et presque personne ne sait que Schwarz-Bart a construit son roman La mulâtresse, comme il l'avait fait pour Le Dernier des Justes, autour d'événements historiques, authentiques et symboliques qu'il a attribués à la mulâtresse solitude, dont il a trouvé le nom chez un historien du 19e siècle et quelques lignes dont il a beaucoup modifié d'ailleurs l'impact, puisque d'une femme très violente et anti-française, il a fait une femme relativement douce, non violente, mais pourtant héroïne militaire. Et il est entendu aujourd'hui aux Antilles qu'il s'agit d'un personnage historique et que c'est une héroïne nationale. On a voulu la faire entrer au Panthéon. Et il est pratiquement impossible de dire aujourd'hui que c'est une image littéraire créée de toutes pièces par un écrivain. Alors, je voudrais votre éclairage qui est tellement important. Moi, je vois ça du point de vue littéraire et la genèse de l'œuvre. Et je voudrais avoir que vous replaciez la réception du roman dans en fait votre présentation générale.
Merci. Je serai bref. Je vois qu'il y a d'autres participants qui voudraient intervenir et qui sont, je crois, mieux placés que moi pour vous répondre. Je dirais seulement que la suppression du mot mulâtresse, cette question est évidente. Cette suppression relève du politiquement correct, qui est le fléau qui nous bat tous, partout sur le globe en ce moment. Aux États-Unis, j'ai publié quelques articles d'opinion à Washington dans un journal dématérialisé pour dénoncer les effets néfastes du politiquement correct dans les universités. Et c'est aussi, je crois que je peux dire cela sans risquer la contradiction, une occasion de récupérer solitude à Paris pour le gouvernement, c'est-à-dire pour récupérer politiquement solitude et la situer dans un discours dominant. Pour le reste, je crois que je vois Catherine Gissels, que je connais, voudrait intervenir.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see a lot of colleagues back. I want to say hello to Bill Miles and to James. It has been a long time. So first of all, I want to add a little bit to what has been said by Francine, because the first statue for Solitude in Bainbridge also does not mention André Schwarz-Bart. So I think it is highly problematic also locally in the French Antilles that a woman named Solitude is like erased. I think we really have to reestablish André Schwarz-Bart as the founding father of this feminist, and I would even say womanist literature. That's the first point I want to make. So the fact that Le Jardin in Paris does not mention neither the author, neither this typical character has already a long history, because in Guadeloupe itself, I was very shocked to see that André Schwarz-Bart is never mentioned. And even in the Memorial Act, I visited twice the new Museum of Slavery, and André Schwarz-Bart is not visible there. So as a Polish Jewish writer, he still is outside the canon locally, and both, I would say, in post-slavery and post-Shoah literature. That's a very important statement I want to make. Now, coming back to what James very convincingly showed us, was this perspective of Glissant as a sociologist, because his training in the first place is a sociologist to start with. And secondly, the fact that women play only a minor role. So if I may, I would just like to add a little bémol and say that what I really found a little bit disappointing in the novelist Glissant is that he does not give the mulatto women, the women of mixed descendants, a pivotal role, whereas André Schwarz-Bart's wife and even André has been doing that all the time. From their first novel until the new posthumous novels, the women of color are always at the heart of the novels. And that's a very important statement coming from a male white author, I would say, working together also with a woman of color from Guadeloupe. So I really would like to question a little bit the fact that Glissant is making, like Aimé Césaire, a battery of heroes of the French Antilles. And he's gonna place Louis d'Algrès in the middle of this lineage of national heroes, or I would say Caribbean heroes. Nowhere Glissant mentions Solitude as a good example of a female hero. That's really something that I want to problematize. But now to go back to this very nice presentation, I missed the beginning, I must apologize, and I'm not gonna talk much longer. I just want to point out another big gap that we as literary critics and historians of French literary milieu should make. It is the fact that James mentions Glissant, who is, you clearly said, a difficult author to read, etc., a theorist. How do you explain, James, that writers just like Tardon are not more visible? Is it not our responsibility to bring them back into the picture? Tardon with Starkenfurst is really, really neglected. There's not a lot of scholarship There's not a lot of criticism. Is it not for the 21st century from today on our task also to bring into the canon those forgotten figures? That's my direct question to James. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I will answer that directly and give credit where credit is due. When I started work on this book, I had seen references to Raphaël Tardon in bibliographies, but no one I had read, no literary critic or historian, had said anything about him that would have called him to my attention. It was only when I began to raise questions with a friend in Cambridge about this question of la pariade, which seemed to me strange, that he pointed me in the direction of Raphaël Tardon. That was Jean Calfat. He and I exchanged emails for a good 6 months, I think, in 2016, 2017 over this question, and at one point considered publishing something jointly on the question because we both thought it was important. Finally, he was too busy with multiple editions of Fanon, and I went ahead with this book. And I simply wanted to let you know that it is because Jean Calfat was already on the case that I became aware of the significance of Tardon. Now, for me, Raphaël Tardon, he's a minor novelist. His fiction is poorly written. His essays are very narrow and, how shall I say, programmatic claims for the superiority of the mulatto ethno class, precisely at the time when negritude was emerging. It was a counter discourse to negritude that he was elaborating. The reason to talk about Tardon now is, I would suggest, to put him in the same ideological context with Césaire over the contestation of who we are as Antillais. When Césaire suppresses the name of Tardon, whom I don't believe he ever mentioned, that is an ideological and, in the broadest sense, political act, which is to say that this is not indifferent. So I agree with Kathleen that we need to attend to Tardon, but not in the hope of making a great writer of him, which he never was. But his position in positioning his ethno-class ideologically was, and for us should be, of some significance.
Thank you.
Thank you for making that point.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Simone? No? Okay. Okay.
So we can close the session, Galia, and I thank greatly to James for joining, for his presentation, for his brilliant presentation, and I thank you all for this stimulating discussion. And Galia, I'll give you to say the last words.
Thank you for kindly sharing with us chapters of your book and also the pre-prepared conference. For those who have not yet read the paper, I can send it again because some of the passages which were not mentioned orally are extremely interesting and enlightening. So please feel free to write to me and I will send you the conference paper again. Also, I'd like to mention that our seminary will go on next semester as well. The program will be sent out. So those of you who would like to join some other sessions are most welcome from all around the globe. Please join us and I will send you the links to our future conferences. Thank you very much again, James. It was wonderful of you to share your time with us. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been very enjoyable. I was very pleased with the quality of the questions and discussion. Let me say before we all close off that I really must thank Tal for presenting the diapo that illustrated several of my points. I'm sure you found them helpful. Thank you again.
Thank you again. Thank you. And just to answer sorry, your last name is Gissels, but I'm sorry, sorry. So Madame Gissels, our next session will be held next week on January 18 at 9 o'clock Paris time, 10 o'clock Tel Aviv time. And it will be on objects in literature. Comment la littérature pense les objets par Martha Carayon, by Martha Carayon from Lausanne. So we'll keep it global. Thank you so much, James, and see you all again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.